these stories. And so most likely the audience is made up of Jewish Christians. That's where the name of the letter comes from. We also have clues from chapter 10 that this church community was facing persecution and even imprisonment because of their association with Jesus. Some in the community were walking away from Jesus and abandoning the faith altogether. And this explains the purpose and the structure of this letter. First, there's a short introduction, which is followed by 4 sections where the author compares and contrasts Jesus with key people and events from Israel's history. Jesus is first compared with angels in the Torah, second with Moses and the Promised Land, third with priests and Melchizedek, and lastly with the sacrifices in the covenant. And the author has 2 main goals in all of these contrasts. The first goal is to elevate Jesus as superior to anyone or anything else, showing that Jesus is worthy of all their trust and devotion. But his second goal is this: it's to challenge the readers to remain faithful to Jesus despite persecution. So in every section, he includes a strong warning not to abandon Jesus. So let's dive in now and see how this all unfolds. The elevation of Jesus begins in the opening sentence of the introduction. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors in many different ways, but in these last days, he has spoken to us in his Son. So the author's saying that Jesus is superior to all of the previous ways that God has revealed himself to Israel. He then makes this astounding claim that Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's nature. These metaphors are making the closest possible identification between Jesus and God. So Jesus is what the rays of light are to the sun, or Jesus is what the wax impression is to the signet ring. For this author, there is no God apart from Jesus. Jesus is God become human as the Son. And it's this elevated view of Jesus that's then explored throughout the rest of the letter. In the first section, the author compares Jesus with angels, which might strike you as kind of odd, like why angels? In Jewish tradition, it was taught, based on Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2, that the Torah and the words of God were delivered to Moses at Mount Sinai by angels. And so by saying that Jesus is superior to angels, the author is claiming that Jesus and his message of good news are superior to all previous messengers of God's word. And so the first warning flows from this very point. If Israel was called to pay attention to the Torah that was delivered by angels, how much more should we pay attention to the message that was announced by the Son of God? And not only that, given Jesus' status high above the angels, how remarkable is it that he gave up that high status to become human, to suffer, and to die? In Jesus, we see God's greatest glory and God's great humility as Jesus sympathetically joined himself to humanity's tragic fate. In chapters 3 and 4, the author moves on to argue that Jesus is superior to Moses, who led the people of Israel through the wilderness and built the tabernacle. Jesus is also the leader of God's people, but in him we see not the builder of just a tent, but of all creation. Then the author retells the story of how the Israelites rebelled against Moses in the wilderness, and they lost their chance to enter into the rest that God offered them in the Promised Land. And so here comes the second warning. If Jesus is greater than Moses, how much higher are the stakes if we rebel against him? We also are in a wilderness-like environment where we have to trust God for the future rest in God's new creation. So let's make sure that we don't rebel like Israel did in the wilderness and lose out on God's gracious offer to enter his new creation. In chapters 5 through 7, the author then compares Jesus with Israel's priests that come from the line of Aaron. Their role was to represent Israel before God and to offer sacrifices that atoned for or covered over the sins of the people. But, he points out, the priests were themselves morally flawed people, and so they constantly had to offer sacrifices for their own sins as well as for everybody else's. Something more was needed. And so he then argues that Jesus was that something more. He's the ultimate priest. But Jesus did not come from the line of Aaron. Rather, Jesus was a priest in the order of Melchizedek, that mysterious priest king from ancient Jerusalem, and he appears in the stories about Abraham. We also find in Psalm 110 that the Messianic king from the line of David will be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. So the author's whole point is this: Jesus is the ultimate priest king. He's morally flawless, he's eternally available for his people, and so he's superior to any other mediator between God and humans. And thus comes his warning in this section. To reject Jesus is to reject one's best and only chance to be fully reconciled to God, so don't do that. Which transitions us into the last comparison in chapters 8 through 10. The author shows how Jesus' death on the cross was the ultimate sacrifice, superior to all the animal sacrifices offered in the temple. Those sacrifices had to be offered constantly, both daily but also yearly on the Day of Atonement. Jesus offered his life once and for all, and it was sufficient to cover the sins of the whole world. And so the author warns the audience from walking away from Jesus. It's like turning your back on a gracious offer of God's forgiveness. Why would you do that? Jesus' sacrifice is permanent, he says, and it's the foundation for the new covenant spoken of in the prophets, where all sins are forgiven. So now that the author has elevated Jesus through all of these contrasts, this final section is one big challenge to follow Jesus. So think big picture. In Jesus, they have found God's very word. In Jesus, they have hope for the new creation. Jesus is their eternal priest. He's the perfect sacrifice. And so now they should follow all the great models of faith found throughout the story of the scriptures, and they should remain faithful to Jesus, trusting that despite whatever hardship and persecution, God will not abandon his people. That's the basic flow of thought throughout the letter, which the author calls right here at the very end a brief word of exhortation. Here's a couple of extra tips for reading this letter. Whenever the author quotes from the Old Testament scriptures, which is like every other sentence, stop and go look up the reference and read that quotation in its original context. And sometimes you'll be puzzled, but more often you'll see all kinds of extra cool connections that you would never notice otherwise. It's totally worth the effort. You should also just know that these warning passages, they're going to make you uncomfortable, and that's kind of the point. They're not there to make you afraid. They're there to show you that rejecting Jesus is foolish because he's so awesome. These warnings all serve the larger purpose of the letter, to show that Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God's love and mercy. And that's what the letter of the Hebrews is all about.
By the way, that's a mouthful. And of course, a lot to, so what I would suggest, if you want, is you can go to the, hold on, sorry. The story is that no, we're not doing the Book of Job. The main character, Job, is not even the author. Let's get rid of that. Yeah, you can go to their website and download that whole outline as a poster. It's on a PDF or something like that. And I've got it downloaded right here. We can refer to it, but it just kind of gives you kind of like, a little bit of a visual, especially if you're a visual learner or something like that, like I am, of how the book is outlined. That's kind of like the help with a poster like that, because there's always real structure to these books, and sometimes it's difficult to see in Hebrews. It looks like it's jumping around, and there's different ways that you can parse that outline, but there is a flow of thought there. What we are going to be doing is sort of what in the video they suggested at the end of the video. Whenever you see references to the Old Testament, stop and look at those references, because the writer of Hebrews assumes that you know what he's talking about, not to us, because he didn't write it to us directly. He wrote it to an audience that knew this stuff, somebody who had been taught, and probably somebody Jewish, right? So he's referring to things that, like, they see. Some of those things are difficult to just see, even like in the church right now, because there's sort of things we don't talk much about, right? Or at all. And so we're going to be kind of going back into those things. And, whenever we see something that has a reference that we should know about, we're going to go look at it, and sometimes we're going to be able to figure it out. Sometimes we won't, So here's some kind of like some of the importance of the book. First of all, the book of Hebrews is key. Okay. It lays out a lot of the groundwork for the future discussions that the church had later on about Christ's divinity versus Christ's uh, deity. I mean, versus his humanity. And um, there was a council called the Council of Chalcedon, which was, I forget when it was, but people were kind of getting out of hand with these discussions, because they would either emphasize Christ's humanity in a way and say things that took away his divinity, or like that he's God, or they would say things to the effect that they would emphasize his divinity in a way that would diminish his humanity. And there's a tension between those things, and I don't think that like, I don't think anybody's really successful in explaining all of that. There's part of that that's and a big part of it that's going to be left a mystery. And one of the tendencies that we have is that when somebody emphasizes or points out something about the humanity of Jesus, that you're going to have a group of people who are going to accuse them of saying that they don't have that they're ignoring Christ's divinity, or vice versa. You got people saying, well, Jesus this, that, and they want to emphasize divinity, and then people go, well, you seem like you're denying his humanity. And so there's always going to be that debate. But what the council kind of like came up with was that whatever you argue about, you can have these arguments, and there's going to be a little bit of tension there, but you can't deny these two things. You can't deny his humanity, and you can't deny his divinity. The other thing that it helps balance out is that you have the grace message and salvation by grace through faith, and then on the other hand, you have works. And it's funny, we were talking about this last night at Men, right? We were talking about what you see there in James, and so this book really shows you both sides of that coin, kind of like taking James and comparing him to Paul's writings or something like that, but it's in one book. So this book became a central book in the New Testament for people to refer back to, and really get a hold on those two things. It also helps clarify why there was a law in the first place, because you're like, okay, there was an old covenant, but now you have a new covenant. What was the purpose of the old covenant? And what the author is going to show you is that the old covenant really points to Christ. Everything in the Old Testament, ultimately, that the entire story points to Christ. So what are the things in the law that really pointed to Christ? And you see them outlined in the temple itself, and you see it outlined in the practices of the priests. And we'll get a little bit more into that today. But despite not having a definite authorship, nobody knows who wrote the book, and it most likely wasn't Paul. Okay, it was some people think it was a guy named Apollos. Some people thought it was Priscilla. I don't think it was Priscilla, because the author uses a pronoun to refer to himself that's in the masculine. And huh?
Right here, this is a study Bible. Different suggestions.
Yeah, there's a lot of conjecture, and it's kind of like yeah, you can look it up and you can find people's opinions about it, but nobody really knows. And so I think Apollos is probably like one of the better candidates. There was Priscilla. I don't think it was her, but it was somebody who had contact and knew the apostles. So it's somebody who is kind of like a secondhand witness. Somebody who was exposed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Paul, and knew those people, or a lot of those people. So when they were canonizing it, in the church later on, and they were, like with 300 AD, trying to canonize some of these books, Hebrews was a bit controversial because everybody knew who wrote the rest of the books that we have in the New Testament, but nobody knew about Hebrews, and that was kind of one of the criteria that they were looking for. Do we know who wrote this book? Where did it come from? But it had become uh, such a foundational reading in all of the church, the Eastern Church, the Western Church, that everybody just kept it in their canon because they're going, no, this book is too important. We don't know who wrote it, but it's really important. So um, now, one of the things that like this you're going to see again and again in this book is this idea of better than. Okay, you know, Jesus is better than the angels, or Jesus is, we have a better covenant now, we have better this, better that. But what I want to get across today is this, okay? It's more than better than, because what the author is going to do is that he's not saying that like it's better than. He's saying a lot of times that no, the Old Testament, like the temple, that was a model. Okay, what you have in heaven is the real thing. What you have with the priesthood and the practices of the priesthood was a pattern, but that pattern or that model is based on a reality that's even bigger, or it's not even bigger, it's the real thing. It was always to point you to the real thing. Like an easy example would be sacrifices. Okay, if you had bulls, goats, and lambs, or whatever sacrificed, you could sacrifice. You had all these sacrifices at the altar, but then Jesus, his death and his sacrifice, um, has always been the real thing. Because Hebrews doesn't say this, but we see in Revelation that he is the Lamb slain from the foundation of the earth. So even before the earth existed, he was the sacrifice. He was the sacrifice before any of this began. Much, much later, and in the history of man, God institutes sacrifice for the Levites to carry out. And Abraham practiced sacrifices, but those are a reflection of the real sacrifice that Christ was going to make later on in history, but had already in principle made since the beginning of the earth. The writer of Hebrews is saying this is the real thing. Jesus has always been the real thing, and he's been there before the creation of the earth. The world was made through him. He comes very close to saying something like John would say. He's there from the he was there from the before the foundation of the earth. So that he's the real thing. So, and then like you do these better than comparisons, like angels judge. He's better than the angels, but he's saying he's in a different category than the angels altogether, because the angels, they rule with God, if you understand the divine council, and they are his divine, they judge and they rule, and they're over things. But Jesus is enthroned with God. He's not like just in the council itself. He's not just in the council. He's on the throne and in the judging seat with the Father. So, and that's what he is inheriting, right? Not only that, but Jesus is the ultimate priest. So here's like uh, you know a question here, about like priests. Like somebody like a first century Jew would go, well, what qualifies Jesus to be any kind of priest? Because he's not from the tribe of Levi, right? In fact, Jesus couldn't even go into the Holy of Holies as an Israelite in first century Jerusalem. And there are places that the priests, the Levites could go, that Jesus, while he's walking the earth, couldn't even enter into the temple, which is kind of ironic. But what happens is that Jesus, the writer of Hebrews refers to him as a priest that existed way before Levi, and he goes, remember Melchizedek back in Abraham's day? He's, it's like Jesus is in the order of Melchizedek, so he gets him in that way. But I'm going next week. We're going to explore Melchizedek, because David picks up on this theme and he sees somebody from his lineage being in the order of Melchizedek. And he's not in the tribe of Levi either. But here's a king of Judah, who comes to the throne and sees that one of his sons, or somebody in that royal line of his, the Messiah, is going to be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. David brings it up centuries before Hebrews does. So when the writer of Hebrews mentions it, the Jew who's listening to this is thinking, yeah, David saw that, and David started even kind of like acted it out. He puts on a linen ephod and dances before the Lord. He basically dresses like a priest. He wasn't naked, by the way. He dresses like a priest and he dances before the Lord. It was a linen ephod. It's not underwear. It's a priestly garment. It's a tunic, right? Well, it's a priestly tunic, right? And then of course you have all those, Jesus being the ultimate sacrifice. It doesn't need to keep on, offering himself, like time after time. He's the permanent sacrifice because he was slain from the foundations of the earth. And so, the writer takes this logic and goes, okay, well, how much more then? If it was that, and that was just a model, and it had its limitations because it wasn't quite the real thing, how much more should we be following this and not following away from the real thing, and the salvation that's come to us? That's kind of the line of thinking that he's making here. So I'll tell you, like, one of the things that got me intrigued with the book, and it was in Revelation, okay? And it had to do with priests and the temple and the tabernacle in Revelation. Because when I was reading through Revelation, one of the things that I kind of skipped over and like didn't really hit me until much later was the fact that you have a temple in heaven. And, like, you can see why you have a temple on earth, because what you're trying to create is a place for God to dwell with humans on earth, right? That's what the tabernacle is about. And that's what the temple was about. It's actually what the Garden of Eden is about, because the temple and the temple and the tabernacle are patterned a lot after Eden. If you went in there, there was all this imagery of fruits and paradise, and it's like the presence of God. And the cherubim were in the Garden of Eden as well. That was the place where God met with man and hung out with him, and was kind of like, you're going to rule. You are a king, you are a priest, and of course all of that gets messed up. But I was thinking, but why is there a temple in heaven? And I used to think of it kind of like in the sense that, a temple on earth would be kind of like heaven's embassy here on earth, and then the temple in heaven is sort of like earth's embassy in heaven, something like that. And maybe there is something to that point of view. But what the writer of Hebrews is saying is that no, the real temple where God really wants to dwell with man is in heaven, and it's always been that way. There's the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of God. That is the human one sitting next to God. Christ, having become one of us, sitting as a human on the throne in heaven. It's a massive implication to us that we have a human sitting on heaven's throne. Think about that. And he did that because he wants to rule with us. All of the promises that God makes to Christ, the promises that God makes to Christ, rule and you're king. He's of course King of Kings, but it implies that there's other kings, and the other kings are the ones that he's chosen to rule with him. So here, I'll give you some examples that I'm talking about in Revelation. Verse 13 in Revelation 1, it says, "In the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe," okay, a long robe, and with a golden sash around his chest. And we know that this is Jesus. You know what this robe and this golden sash is around his chest? And like a bunch of commentators pick up on this. This is priestly garments. He's dressed up like a priest. So the writer of Revelation is already showing you, just like in Hebrews, that we have a high priest in heaven who represents us, right? In verse 3 in Revelation 8, verse 3, it says, another angel came and stood at the altar with the golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints, and on the golden altar before his throne. So you have this altar of incense, just like you did in the temple. And what you have is an angel doing a priest's job. So this angel here is acting like a priest. Revelation 11:19, it says, then God's temple in heaven was open, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. There's an ark of the covenant in the heavenly temple. It's not like the ark that they built here on earth, I don't think, you know.
It's in relation to the earthly covenants in Joshua too.
Yeah, it's exactly. So what the ark of the covenant that we had here, right, is a reflection of what's in heaven. So what's in heaven is the real thing.
Because God gave instructions to Moses on how to.
He exactly, yeah. Exactly. That's exactly where I'm going with this. Yeah, yeah. I'm going to come up to that verse. I think. Okay, so if I don't have that verse, what Aaron was saying was that, and Hebrews brings this up when he tells Moses and he brings him up to the mountain and he says, "Go down there and build a tabernacle according to the pattern that you saw on the mountain." We think, oh, he got the blueprints. No, he saw the real thing. He was invited up into that presence of God. He saw something there. God is going saying, go down there and build something like that. You know, and so from the tabernacle on, there was something in heaven that was, well, it could have been a blueprint, but it's patterned after the things in heaven. Verse 9, Revelation 14:17. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has authority over fire. So you got, again, the mention of the temple in heaven. And then you have another one who came out from the altar. There's an altar there, right? It doesn't have blood and goats on, sheep on it or anything. This is an altar of the living Christ's blood, but there's an altar in heaven.
In Matthew 13, 16 it tells about, explains the parable of the weeds. He who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seeds are the sons of the kingdom, but the tares are the sons of the wicked one. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels.
Yeah, they're acting.
It's direct connection to. That's really cool.
Oh yeah, you're talking about the sickle part. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. After this I looked. This is in Revelation 15. After this I looked, and the sanctuary of the tent of witness in heaven was opened. So tent of witness, as far as I can tell, is tabernacle, right? And out of the sanctuary, because there's a sanctuary in there. There's a sanctuary in a tent in heaven, okay? Came 7 angels with the 7 plagues, clothed in pure bright linen with golden sashes around their chests, just like the Son of Man was in chapter 2, right? Where they're wearing these white linen garments, bright linen with golden sashes around their chest, priestly garments. We have a high priest who is Christ, but we have angels who are acting as priests. By the way, a note here, a priest is somebody who represents creation to God and God to creation, or people to God.
Ministers of,
you minister on behalf of some. So we have there are ministering angels, and they function in a priestly capacity. And then you have priests on earth who minister in a priestly capacity. So they represent the praises of creation before God, and also make supplications and do offerings and those sorts of things, and those are done through priests. But there's a big story there, because ultimately Paul tells us that we are a kingdom of priests, and we start being called priests. If you are one of Christ, you are a priest, and you are called to be a priest, and function in that capacity as well. You may not be lighting up incense and bringing offerings, because the offering's been done, but you make supplications on behalf of people. You intercede for people, and do those things.
Building up the church.
Building up the church
Spiritually.
Yeah, exactly.
Supporting brothers and
Right.
sisters.
Yeah. You act as a go-between for your brothers and sisters,
When you did that study, it's that, but it's also really.
Yeah. Yeah, once you get it, once you get like a picture of it and it settles in your heart, like the whole priests kings theme, then you start taking it a lot more seriously. If you really let it sink in. So for you guys who were at the men's Bible study, we were talking about the kings being a king, right? And you see that as a theme all the way back to Adam. Rule over the earth, subdue it, that's king language. And then you have work and keep. Those two words, I forget what it was, abad and some other word. The only time in the scripture that those are used together, other than in Genesis, there in Genesis 2, is when the priests were in the temple working and keeping the temple. Yeah. So what you have is you have like that working in the temple as priests in an Eden kind of setting, right, where God meets with man. Is the original version of that was the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve were kings and priests, working and keeping the garden and ruling on behalf of Christ. And if you remember what N.T. Wright said, this idea of kings and priests is summing up creation's blessings before God and bringing God's rule to bear on earth. It's a beautiful sentence. I've actually kind of memorized it, it seems.
You said that you only find those two words.
You only find those two words, to work and keep, elsewhere in the Bible in conjunction when it's referring to the priests working and keeping the either the tabernacle or the temple. Yeah, so it's them working as priests. So verse 8 of Revelation 15, and the sanctuary was filled with smoke from the glory of God. Remember, you had the glory of God's smoke, and like you saw passages there within the Exodus, or in Exodus, and also like in like some of the numbers, but also like the what do you call it, prophetic books. So you have this, and no one could enter the sanctuary until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels was finished. Now this is interesting, Revelation 21, okay, because this is important to the idea of like the temple. And I saw no temple in the city. This is talking about the New Jerusalem, okay? Ultimately, there will be no temple either on earth or in heaven. There's going to be a new heavens and a new earth. Earth is not, in its state, is not permanent, neither is heaven. So it's going to be a new heavens and new earth, okay? I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God the Almighty and the Lamb, because God is just dwelling with man at this point, and man is dwelling with God. We become a family, and we don't, it's like there's no need for another kind of a temple, so that's I wanted to kind of like whet your appetite for some of these things, because it's the big story of the Bible that we tend to miss sometimes. Yeah, and it's like we're going back into the garden, going back to the Garden of Eden in a sense, but in a grander way. So Hebrews 8, it says, Hebrews 8, 5, here's actually the verse that we were referring to. They serve, and it's talking about like the temple and the sacrifice and all that kind of stuff. They serve as a shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain. So there, the writer of Hebrews is basically telling you that the tabernacle, the temple were made, and they're a copy and a shadow of the things that Moses actually saw. So I want you, so like one of the things that I think is important is our conception of heaven, because in a lot of popular Christianity, what we think of is like you die and you go to heaven, you leave earth, you forget all about earth, and then you're in heaven forever. And then heaven is like your new home, and it's like maybe it's a big country or something like that. And we think of it that way. The Bible doesn't describe it ever that way. Okay. Heaven is the courtroom. It is where God and the heavenly council rule the cosmos from. That's even when you're talking about like in my Father's house there are many mansions. Well, first of all, that's probably a mistranslation. It refers to rooms. There's many rooms, and it's the same word that were used for the rooms where the priests used to come when they'd come from all over Israel and Judah, and they'd go and do their priestly duties as Levites. There were many rooms there at the temple that they could put their stuff in and live there for a while they were doing their priestly duties, right? But even if you're talking about mansions, what we're talking about is a royal, it's like the palace. It's the royal seat of power, okay? It's like the president lives at the White House with his family. You know, that's kind of like more the idea. It's not like it's yeah, you live there, but what do you rule? You rule the cosmos from it. You rule the earth from it, right? So it's a house in the sense of where a royal family resides, and it has servants and it has sons. Okay, servants are, you know, like angels are servants, but you know, are actually they're sons of God, but you know, you could see things being you know, like servants. But what I want to emphasize there, and it has sons, because what a son of God means is that you're part of that royal family. Okay, that's part of the meaning of that. It's so heaven is not where you go to forget all about the things that are past, because that is referring to the new to the new heavens and new earth. That is about a time in history when all of this has been resolved and you have a new heavens, new earth, and death has been done away with, and then the things of the past are going to be forgotten. That's when, you know, like the former things were remembered no more. But heaven, and even the saints in heaven, the people who have gone before us, are concerned with us, and heaven is concerned with earth, because heaven rules earth. And the writer of Hebrews makes a point of this. It says, you know, he goes and shows you all about these people who had great faith, and then goes on and tells you, therefore, you know, because we're surrounded by such a big cloud of witnesses, they're witnesses to us. These are people who have gone before us, but they're not oblivious to what we're going on or what's going on with us. They're rooting us on. They're witnesses to what we're doing, and they're witnesses to their experience with God. And the writer of Hebrews is telling us that's that's another reason to hold on to your faith, because you've got people saying you got to hold on to your faith, because we went through a lot of everything that you can imagine, including the things that you're going through now, persecution and hard times, but at the same time, things that happen because of faith and because of perseverance and holding on to the word. And now you're going to, and we're rooting you on, because we know what it's like, you know, like make it, you know. So in Revelation 6, it says I'm sorry, Aaron, you had something?
Oh, yeah, no, I was just gonna, in relation to, the temple, right here, Paul's writing, in 2 Corinthians 12. It is doubtless not profitable for me to boast. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body I do not know, or whether out of the body I do not know, God knows. Such a one was caught up to the third heaven.
Okay, yeah. Hold on to that thought. We'll address that later on, maybe. Okay. I have a thought about that. But anyway, let's Revelation 6. Here's a verse about saints who are during the tribulation are coming up, and they're being slaughtered, but they're showing their souls are showing up to heaven, right? They said they cried out with a loud voice, "O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" Then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were killed as they themselves had been. These guys are showing up to heaven saying, when are you going to take vengeance? When are you going to return and set things straight on the earth? It's not like they don't care. These they're intimately they're intimately involved in what's going on earth. Of course, Hebrews 12, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, also in Hebrews 12, in verse 22, it says, "You have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect." He is telling you, you got to picture yourself as being in this community already. Even though you're on earth and you're being persecuted, you're coming, you've come to the mountain of God. And on the top of the mountain of God is where that's where the divine council is meeting, and you're surrounded by these cloud of witnesses, which were earlier in the chapter, and you're surrounded by innumerable angels, and we're in festal gathering because we see the hope, we see the things that are to come. Sherry, you got a question? Sherry, you raised your hand.
Hi, Mark. Sorry about that.
Yeah,
Could
that's okay.
that, could that also be similar to being considered a citizen of heaven before
Yeah.
you?
Right,
Okay.
right. And Paul says something similar, because what he says, your citizenship is from heaven, and from it, so Paul already talks as if we're in heaven. He's not talking about the place so much as he's saying we're in that courtroom setting. We're in that divine council. We're part of that already. That's why Paul keeps on telling people stuff like, don't go suing each other as Christians, because don't you know you're going to judge even angels? Like you're going to be not just among the angels, like ruling like the angels have ruled, but you're going to be ruling over some of them, right? So, and maybe over all of them. I don't know how this is going to work out in the end, but he's saying, let the least of you sort out these kind of affairs, because you got to get used to the idea that you're in the divine council, and he